More than a dozen Armenian and Azerbaijani soldiers have been killed in recent days in clashes between the two former Soviet republics, which have long been at odds over the Nagorno-Karabakh region. This flare-up is one of the worst instances of fighting since 2016 and could spark trouble not only for the Caucasus region and its peoples, but also for world powers like Russia and the United States. We're going to talk about this and more on today's episode of the Tonic Accord. All right, guys, let's get right into it. I'm joined once again by my co-host and good friend Alex, and we're going to just kind of tackle this really complex but interesting flare-up of an issue that's happened recently in the region, the Caucasus Mountains region, in between Armenia and Azerbaijani. So there is a lot of context to give, and we'll get into it, but just to get some initial thoughts. Alex, what are your initial thoughts?
Well, okay, so yeah, like you said, there is a lot of context, but this is a complicated region that I think has been exasperated by the fact that Azerbaijan is historically an oil just behemoth in the region. Some of the first oil during the Industrial Revolution came out of Baku, so which is one of the biggest cities in Azerbaijan. And so just like going off of that, I think that we need to realize that this is an area that I think the world is going to put a magnifying glass on, even though it could be called a very minor skirmish amongst two very small countries. I think someone said that this is Azerbaijan, for example, is about the size of Minnesota, and Armenia is not much bigger. I think both of them have about 3 million people. So, on a global scale, this seems like just a small regional skirmish that has a lot of historical context, and which it does, like you said. But also, I think the reason why you and I are talking about this and why we've seen this as a big headline is because Azerbaijan is a huge oil behemoth, and a lot of, especially Europe, is counting on their oil. So a lot of people are looking. Russia as well, Armenians, and the West. So yeah, that's just my thoughts, but we'll definitely get into all that deeper.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a little bit of historical context, and believe me when I say this is a very long rabbit hole to go down. So I am, of course, upfront, I am by no means an expert, and so if there's any Armenian or Azerbaijani listeners, yeah, I'm probably going to get some things wrong, but just hear me out. So we do have to have an understanding of this region, the Nagorno-Karabakh region of southwestern Azerbaijan. Why is that so contentious? Well, this area of the Caucasus region, including all of these countries, has been occupied by many empires over the last few hundred years. Russian czars, the Ottoman Empire, and the Iranian Empire before that have all controlled this area at different times. But more recently, pre-World War I, the Russian Tsar owned it. During that time, they actually conducted surveys in between these two regions, and they found it was actually very mixed ethnic integration. A lot of Azerbaijani and Armenian peoples living in the same towns, the same regions. And that was just, they conducted those surveys just to get an understanding of strategic capabilities and to, how to maintain power of the peoples. But quickly after that, in the midst of World War I, the Tsars fell. And this was in the beginning of the Russian Revolution. During that time, there was a brief moment of independence after all these empires owned this area. There was actually an attempt at the Transcaucasian nation, which was Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, to try and create a multi-ethnic state made up of different peoples and religions, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, etc. Unfortunately, this quickly failed and broke up into the three kind of countries we know today, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. Not long after that kind of failed experiment, the Red Army came in, and Soviet Russia then absorbed these states into Soviet states with semi-autonomous republics. So Armenia was kind of its own area, Azerbaijan kind of its own thing, and Georgia, but they were all still underneath the umbrella of the Soviet Union and ultimately answered to Moscow. This is where a lot of the problems today really started to kind of come up, because in the midst of the World War I, a lot of these regions were just kind of borderless zones that were just kind of multi-ethnic states. Now that the Soviet Union was trying to create real borders and have real kind of governance over these regions, they had to kind of decide where these regions lied as far as, are they Azerbaijani, are they Armenian? So Joseph Stalin created a committee that decided to, in quotes, leave Karabakh in the hands of Azerbaijani. That language is really contentious because he's not saying he's giving Karabakh to the Azerbaijani. He's saying we're going to leave Karabakh as Azerbaijani. However, that area is today ethnically Armenian, and that's where a lot of the contention lies. Now, if you look on the map, there's actually a part of Azerbaijani that's almost an island, and it's kind of blocked by Armenian land. It's not connected to the mainland Azerbaijan. The reason for that is, following Stalin's decision to give the Karabakh region to Azerbaijan, there was a lot of conflict, and Armenia then lobbied Moscow to again annex a region called Zangezur, which is the middle one that you see. I will have to put up a map for those on YouTube because trust me, it gets complex. So the reason there's a part of Azerbaijan as a little island off in the side is because Russia, to appease Armenia, then gave back some of this region to Armenia. And so a lot of these regions that used to be multi-ethnic, comprised of both Muslims and Christians, both Azerbaijani and Armenia, then became definitively decided as Armenian and Azerbaijani. Once Moscow then decided these regions, the respective republics did their best to expel the other ethnicity out of their region. And this caused a lot of conflict as well, right? They wanted to make sure that they locked down their region as, this is Azerbaijani, this is Armenian. Once this happened, it was relatively quiet during Soviet rule for a few decades. But once the Soviet Republic fell, right, the communist Soviet Union fell, the disputes over these regions started to flare up, which led to a war in the early 90s where thousands were killed over this region. And the UN actually condemned the ethnic Armenian use of force against Azerbaijani citizens in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, and is still today considered, a part of Azerbaijan and kind of illegally occupied by 9% of it, I think, is illegally occupied by Armenian forces. So I know that was a lot to take in, and believe me, I skipped over a lot, including Turkey annexed parts of Western Armenia, which might lead to why Armenia wants to annex parts of Eastern. So there's a lot of annexations going on in this area, and it's been changing hands many times, and there's been a lot of ethnic conflict in what used to be a multi-ethnic region. So that's kind of where we are today, just recently last week, an Armenian outpost was put in the Nagorno-Karabakh region as a kind of for strategic importance, which led to the Azerbaijanis getting worried about it, which led to a conflict where 16 people have been killed, including one civilian. Whew.
Yeah, take a breath, have a glass of water there. That was a very nice background, though. I appreciate that, because I think that does a good job of highlighting just the fact that, like you said, this is a multi-ethnic region that is really complicated.
Yeah.
And like kind of going back on what you said, like my kind of takeaway from all this is kind of the facade of authoritarianism when it comes to sectarianism, right? Like we see this time and time again. I mean, we kind of talked about it with Yugoslavia last week, where you kind of have this pseudo fake sectarianism that is created by authoritarianism. And I think this was a big flaw of the Soviet Union, is they held all these states together because the Soviet mantra was very anti-ethnic difference. It was very anti-religion. And so they kind of just kept everything together while ignoring these glaring issues between these different sectarian groups, right? And so I think, again, we see a country like Azerbaijan, which has a lot more Persian roots, right? Historically, you were talking about before they were under Ottoman control and Russian control, they were under Persian and Iranian control.
Right.
And so this is a region that has a lot of Muslim influence, a country that has a lot of Muslim influence. And then you have Armenia, which is a majority Christian country. And so I think when you kind of pull out the authoritarianism regime there, it's going to cause a bit of a collapse in some ways. And I think we've seen that. And of course, Russia's done what they seem to do best, which is kind of appease but also instigate, and that seems to be what's also happening here a little bit. And just the last thing I wanted to add was that I did a little looking too just on Azerbaijan, because I you hear about Azerbaijan for oil, but you don't really hear much else. So I was looking into their past, and I have to say, I typed in on Google, is Azerbaijan today considered a democratic country? And the answer is kind of sort of. They've had a ruling family that has, monopolized wealth and definitely in the pockets of a lot of oil companies and whatnot. But now, the interesting thing I got out of it was a Foreign Policy Research Institute article that talked about in 1918, the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic was the Muslim world's first parliamentary republic. And it only lasted 23 months before the Red Army snuffed it out.
Right.
But I was really fascinated to see that, because everyone talked about how the post-Ottoman Turkish country was the first one, but I think it was them in 1923, and Azerbaijan was in 1918. So that was interesting to see that it was a Turkic-speaking culture that had a lot of Persian, ancestry and connections, but also was kind of the beacon of hope for democracy in the region. And then we saw, like I said, the Soviets kind of come in and snuff out this pluralistic society. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that kind of puts us where we're at today, where the Soviet Union basically hid this for decades, and now it's all been coming out since the 90s. And I think they called it a frozen war or something. There was something they called it. I remember, like a freezing conflict.
A frozen conflict. Right, because that's kind of what happened, right? Because, like, conflict, there was the attempt at the Transcaucasian nation, which just didn't work. And then that's where Azerbaijan, became that, first democracy after Turkey. But the tensions were flaring. Like there was definitely conflict over these regions in that kind of void after the Russian czars were just kind of kaputs. So, when the Soviet Union came in, they kind of seized control, and they were the ones deciding the boundaries that were all still under the Soviet Union umbrella. So they did they literally kind of froze it. Yeah, it's true. They froze it in place. They were pretty strict with their rule. And, even though Armenia and Azerbaijan didn't agree with all the lines that were being drawn, they still had to answer to Moscow, both of them. So they couldn't really do much, right? At the end of the day, what Moscow wanted, Moscow got. And so, yeah, you're right that it's interesting how they did freeze a war, but they didn't solve it. And in many ways, you could argue that they made it worse. Because, again, that's what's so complicated about this region is it's, today recognized as Azerbaijani. It's, the UN Council of Human Rights has even said that Armenia, needs to leave alone, stop trying to occupy it. But then if you look at the demographics, it's a majority ethnic Armenian region. And if you look at even within the Soviet Union in 1988, the Soviet People's Deputies of Karabakh voted 110-17 to request transfer of the region to Armenia, but Moscow rejected it. So you even have a little bit of, again, not obviously Soviet Union's not a democracy, but they do have this deputy system to kind of bring things to attention to Moscow. And even then, with their deputy leaders in that area, they voted overwhelmingly to be Armenian, and Moscow just said no. And only a few years later, the Soviet Union fell. And so there's obviously a lot of desire in the region of the ethnically Armenian peoples to go to Armenia. But what sucks is just how entrenched and globally recognized the borders are, that, I think it'd be really difficult to just kind of give it over to Armenia without upsetting Azerbaijan. And like you said, Azerbaijan is now such an oil power and a potential, for those that are trying to get less oil from Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan looks a lot better. They're, a little more westernly oriented, I guess you could say, than something like Saudi Arabia. And so that might, for many, going to Baku is a good alternative for oil production and buying oil. It's just weird because, there's obviously we can't forget the elephant in the room of the Armenian genocide with Turkey, and Turkey annexed, 4 regions on Western Armenia, Kars and Surmali and others. And, they're kind of allied with Azerbaijani in this conflict, whereas Russia is allied with Armenia in this conflict. Russia provides arms and tanks to Armenia and jets to Armenia, but also is one of the largest suppliers of weapons to Azerbaijan. So you're like, what the hell is going on here? It's like it's a big mess.
I mean, we should probably just change the name of this podcast to "What's the Hell Going On?"
Yeah,
with Drew and Alex first off. But,
yeah, right.
yeah, I mean, I think that'd be a better name at this point. But yeah, I mean, well, first off, like the big takeaway, I see comparisons between the Crimean crisis in some ways
Right.
and this, and the fact that what do you do on an international level when the entire world recognizes, say, Crimea as part of Ukraine and this region as part of Azerbaijan, but it's culturally and historically more connected with the alternative, which was either Russia in the Crimea case or Armenia in this case. And I think it is complicated because we seem to kind of treat borders, or at least our current reconstruction of borders, as kind of an absolute. And maybe we need to re-examine that, because I've seen numbers as high as 95% of people in this region connect with Armenia.
Right.
So, I mean, it's not like it's, split 60-40 or something. And second off, yeah, I mean, I have a theory for why. I mean, first off, Russia involved in the current treaties they have with Armenia are responsible for their security forces. So it is weird that they are kind of supporting both sides, but in different ways. But I do understand why Russia would have a stake in this and would be definitely in defense of Armenia, mainly because I was reading in the U.S. Energy Information website, which is part of the U.S. government, and they were talking about how the Trans-Balkan pipeline, which supplies Russian natural gas to the Balkan countries and Turkey through Ukraine, is one of the region's only existing supply routes. And basically, this is also now supplying oil to Southern Europe and even parts of Western Europe. I've been reading parts where Russia is also supplying Germany with most of their natural gas. And so the interesting thing is that there's Azerbaijani pipelines that are being constructed coming south of Baku that would be an alternative to this Russian pipeline. And so basically, Southern Europe could receive about 565 times more amount of this petroleum on a yearly basis coming from them instead of Russia. And this would obviously be politically great for a lot of Western Europe who have seen Russia as kind of an adversary. And so I think Russia feels threatened here. I mean, Putin is always thinking ahead. And Azerbaijan, I mean, historically, I think they've been producing oil even before the Middle East knew it existed. I mean, this is a country that was important in kind of the oil revolution. And if they can, I mean, personally, my opinion, if they can supply oil to Southern Europe and parts of the West, I would support it over Russia. And I think Russia's feeling the heat, because there was this other thing I saw out of the Council on Foreign Relations where they were talking about how Azerbaijan produces about 800,000 barrels of oil per day. And they're a significant already gas exporter to Europe and Central Asia. And Russia is worried. And so I see this potentially being something like that Saudi-Russian oil trade war that we were talking about back in March, where I think there's going to be global implications because Turkey has pledged to support Azerbaijan. Iran supports Azerbaijan. Russia obviously supports Armenia. And we see a lot of other interests, like the United States has a large Armenian population.
Yeah.
A lot of the West is very anti-Russia. And this is all right in that Baku region, and the new conflict is in Tavus, which is near the Caspian oil and gas pipelines to Western Europe. So, long story short, I think this could blow up in a lot of people's faces, just because Russia needs this continued exportation of gas, and Armenia could also use it. It just depends kind of which side you fall on, and I think that's why it could get ugly and kind of muddled.
Well, that's why. That's a really good point, and that's why it even gets more complicated when you look at the Minsk group. Mm-hmm. The Minsk group was an attempt in the 90s and early 2000s to try and quell the violence in this region, which was co-chaired by the U.S., France, and Russia. Other members include Germany, Italy, Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Portugal, Belgium, and a few others. But mainly the big dogs are the U.S., France, and Russia. And at the time in the 90s, they were able to, get both sides to agree to ceasefires, but pretty much every time they did, one side or the other would eventually go against the ceasefire. We've seen this time and time again. We see this time and time today with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Ceasefires are pretty much ignored after a certain amount of time. So, really the effectiveness of the Minsk group is in question. And Azerbaijan claims that the Minsk group is biased because Russia has too much of a part in it and they're pro-Armenia. So, you wonder, is something like the Minsk group, is that something that we should try and revive and perhaps be a part of this? Or do you do something else without Russia involved? I don't know. It's hard to say. But obviously, it's going to take outside influence and diplomacy to kind of figure this out. These two countries are I mean, I watched a short video where the BBC went to the front line on the Azerbaijani side, and the amount of animosity towards Armenia was palpable. I mean, no one liked Armenians on the Azerbaijani side, and they showed pictures of, Armenia had been, or they claim Armenia had been lobbing missiles into civilian sites on the Azerbaijani side. Now, Armenia, the official government of Armenia, has denied their involvement in any of these conflicts. They say that it's ethnic Armenians in the region fighting on their own accord, right? They're not officially backed by the military or whatnot. So that's Armenia's government position, which is, disputed, right? We don't know if that's true or not at this time. But what we do know is that there definitely are ethnic Armenians in the region fighting against Azerbaijani forces. And the animosity between the two sides has only gotten worse, especially in 2016, where hundreds got killed. And then just recently, 16 more, including one Azerbaijani citizen, like a civilian. It's only going to make these things worse. So I don't see the two sides figuring it out on their own, unfortunately. So we do need to have outside influence, right? But I wonder if something like the Minsk group, which is co-chaired by U.S., France, and Russia, is already in those three two at odds with each other to really come to any kind of productive consensus.
I mean, I almost feel like this is one of those issues where you're right. It would definitely take third-party players to kind of help arbitrate this problem. But I feel like, especially France, the U.S., and Russia, I just don't see that happening, because I think it used to be, especially in the 90s when this was first taking form, you had the U.S. and France on the same page. And unfortunately now, I could almost see Macron, Trump, and Putin completely wanting three different things. And that would be my big metaphor kind of in general for where the world is going right now, is that I almost think it would be hard for like a UN council or, an international group of some form to actually arbitrate something like this, because I think we're seeing that a lot of the things that brought us together, which were especially World War II and then the Cold War, they kind of let us look over some of maybe the differences and like clashes that maybe we would have faced if there wasn't a giant threat. And right now, unfortunately, I don't particularly see any parties being able to come to an agreement unless it's like Russia and France or Russia and the US. I just don't think it could be a multitude of actors. And that's what worries me about that, is that I just think we're almost kind of in this point where, so many things have been suppressed that everyone's trying to get back now. And with the U.S. is not an arbitrator anymore, it would be interesting, and you would have to see countries kind of pick that up. And I mean, like you were talking about earlier, I mean, the UN has condemned this conflict already. But, I mean, as we've talked about before, there's one thing condemning something, and there's another thing actually solving it. Right. And, I mean, talking about this violence, where there's been, where the Armenian side has said they were not involved in this, and so the Azerbaijanis. I mean, there's that Council on Foreign Relations article also warned, and this is in quotes, they said, because Azerbaijani and ethnic Armenian military forces are positioned close to each other and have little to no communication, there was a high risk that inadvertent military action could lead to an escalation of the conflict. And I think that's what we're seeing, because, communication is not great. And so maybe, the higher ups on both governments maybe don't know what's happening on the ground in specific places, and that makes it easier for something bigger to escalate. And I've been thinking this for years, is that I see the world right now kind of similar to the beginning of the 20th century, and not in the good ways, where I see that we're kind of fragmented and based on kind of past alliances. And we have all these small conflicts breaking out. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about India and China, and now we're talking about this conflict. And, we could list a bunch more. And what scares me is that all of these little crises are just building up until there has to be a culmination at some point. And A, there's no global leadership, and B, we're all intertangled. Like I said, like Iran and Turkey support Azerbaijan. You have Russia supporting Armenia. But then they also support different countries in different conflicts, like in Syria and Iran itself. And I'm just worried that all these cross interminglings and cross tanglements are just going to end in something bad. And, going back to the Minsk agreements, I just don't know if anything like that could be created. And it's almost like we need a hard look in the mirror and a hard moment of maybe something worse to put us back in our feet, to realize that, it was the world only came together after World War I ended, right? And I just worry that we need something to kind of shake us again. And that's not me saying I want war, but it's me saying that I don't think the world could really solve much right now.
Well, certainly, like large scale, certainly, this is a theme that we've talked about many times in this podcast, that the diplomatic cohesion of the West, in quotes, is probably at its lowest point in a long time, right? The whole NATO agreement, the U.S. combined with Western Europe, it's not as strong as it once was. And even Angela Merkel has been quoted saying, basically we're on our own, and we can't rely on the United States to be a full-blown ally anymore. So that's a problem of itself. And I think that before we dive into the nitty-gritty of these conflicts, we have to have a diplomatic cohesion again in Western Europe and the United States, because I trust Western Europe and the United States and that relationship way more than I trust the diplomatic superiority of Russia or China, right? That's pretty clear. So I think that's a kind of an underlying issue that we need to solve, to allow us to then the United States to be at the table, to co-chair Minsk groups, to have our kind of power back on the worldwide diplomatic scale. Specifically for this conflict, I think my gut reaction, I'll be honest, my gut reaction is just to let the people of that region vote. I think we know that based off the demographics that it would go back to Armenia if that would be the case. And so then I think okay, if that's the route you go, then what does Azerbaijan get in return? I don't know. Obviously I'm not the one on the ground trying to figure this out, but my gut reaction is, if the people of that region want to be a part of Armenia and don't want to be a part of Azerbaijan, they should have that autonomy to do so. But then again, because these borders were drawn by empires that no longer exist, right? The Soviet Union is no more. We talked about India and China. Think of how many of these border conflicts are because of emperors of past that are not around. The British, the Russians, they're not empires anymore. So, it's such a weird thing that, this region, because of its ethnicity and its ties to Armenia, should probably go back to that. But I also think that Azerbaijan should get something in return. The region of Tavush and Kazakh in the northwestern part of what we're talking about was split in half by Russia. Maybe the half that went to Armenia goes back to Azerbaijan. But again, I don't know the details of the resources and the ethnicities of that region, right? So, I'm just kind of spitballing. But again, my gut is that the peoples on the ground should vote, should have the ability to choose. If they really are overwhelmingly going towards Armenia, they should have the ability to do so. But on top of that, Azerbaijan needs to get something in return. But I just don't know what that would be.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. Definitely in theory, the practicality, like you said, I don't know how you'd go about that. And, second off, I think it's kind of a moving goalpost at that point, Yeah. So, okay, you let this region go back to Armenia, but then every other country in the entire world who maybe has cultural ties to another country,
True.
So it's just so tough where but you're right. It is kind of a bit of an aberration that we still subscribe to boundaries that existed from the ghosts of our past empires, which is interesting, and I do think though that Azerbaijan itself will actually we'll get something out of this. I think that they are in a good they're kind of in a good position with the West, because the West in general, we get most of our oil from the Middle East, and it's very volatile. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of problems. And countries like Europe or regions like Europe and the United States are always looking for more stable places to get oil. And it seems to me that that's where Azerbaijani oil fields could fall. And this would obviously help them even more. I mean, their economy is already dependent on oil, but I think they could even see a bigger boom because Azerbaijan is really cool to me in a lot of ways because it is highly secular. And it's kind of this just messenger on a hill of being a Shia Muslim majority that is highly secular. And if we could do business with them instead of Saudi Arabia, who arguably was involved in everything from 9/11 to Khashoggi's death, I'd be very fine with that. And so I think Azerbaijan could get their comeuppance to a certain extent with that. So who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly complicated, and I do want to, before we wrap this up, right, we're not putting blame on either side for this conflict at this time. It's obviously something that goes back years, hundreds of years. I didn't even get a chance to really talk about even in the early 1800s and stuff. So for those listening, just please understand, right, we're not trying to pin one side against another. We're just trying to look at this conflict and think about, all the factors that are at play here. And just spitball solutions. But again, we're no experts. It's just a fascinating thing that has flared up recently. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's the institutions in place to solve this crisis yet. But hopefully we do get there, and hopefully we get to a point where, there won't be people getting killed over this region. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Had you even heard of this conflict before? Are you from one of these nations or that region and have your own opinion on this matter? We would love to hear it. Either way, leave us a comment, any of your thoughts, and you can catch us at YouTube, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Facebook, Instagram, the works. And thanks again for listening.